For the longest time, the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbase believed that Satoru Gojo was the peak of power in the verse. It's only up until recently that the title has been given to another, and maybe very soon passed down to another again. But the thing is, there's been multiple strongest of multiple eras, one who probably reigned supreme throughout their time. Much like how Gojo was touted as the strongest, the pinnacle of Jujutsu in his time, there's obviously been others with similar claim, and Sukuna just happens to be one of them. So I'm thinking, why don't we talk about the strongest of every era? And this is only possible thanks to the calling games. Because of the reanimation of past sorcerers, we have a pretty good idea of how strong some eras were, but due to the fact that the calling games didn't exactly introduce a very wide cast of characters, there's a whole lot of eras filled with blanks. But I came up with a solution for that, and I'll explain that a bit later. From what we know, and for the most part, Jujutsu begins with the Heian era. Much like how the Heian era was undoubtedly touted as the strongest era of Jujutsu, Sukuna as well was undoubtedly renowned as the strongest of that time, and there was barely anyone who came close. The disparity in time makes things tricky, because some of the weaker sorcerers from the Heian era would fare very well against the strongest of other eras, like we saw with Kashimo and Ishigori, but we're getting to that. Sukuna's title as strongest becomes even more impressive when you analyze some of the other sorcerers from that time. The Heian era was where sorcerers like Kenjaku and Tengen were able to make a name for themselves because of their barrier prowess in Jujutsu. And despite how those two are acclaimed for having the best barrier techniques in all of history, Sukuna still remained one not to trifle with. Domain expansions are barrier techniques after all, and Sukuna's malevolent shrine is known to be one of divine caliber. Kenjaku has openly already admitted inferiority to Sukuna. Tengen wasn't even able to dismantle Kenjaku's domain, so what are his chances of doing that against Sukuna? Yorizu was another strong character from that time period, but we've already seen Sukuna best her. In fact, she was beaten by 15 Fingers Meguna, someone who is nowhere near the full strength of 4-armed Heian era Sukuna. Uro was also from the Heian era, but she's not one to be considered after all. Yorizu single-handedly defeated her entire fleet, the very same Yorizu who pales to the Sukuna in question. Angel barely has feats. Besides, she's from the Heian era, and her sole mission was to defeat Sukuna. The fact that Sukuna was able to turn into cursed objects only leads to the logical conclusion that she was unable to stop him. Uraume, the subordinate of Sukuna, the Ice Curse user, obviously wouldn't be the subordinate if he was stronger. It's believed Uraume follows Sukuna about because he reveres Sukuna's strength. Besides, Uraume doesn't have any feats that would lead us to imply otherwise. Before you go commenting about the 6 Eyes and 10 Shadows users of the past, let's just talk about them. The 6 Eyes user was most definitely not on the same level as Satoru Gojo, because Sukuna was revealed to take out the 5 top clans single-handedly, among those 5 clans being the Fujiwara, the predecessor clan to the Gojos. If that user of the 6 Eyes was any good, then he would have been useful in that assault. But the story never implies that Sukuna was even weighed down by the slightest. For the 10 Shadows user, we can simply write off the bat that no user has ever tamed Maharaga. At this point, knowing every Shikigami, there is absolutely none of them who'd pose a threat to Sukuna, barring Maharaga. With the little gauntlet we just ran, it's pretty safe to say that the title of Heian era strongest belongs to Sukuna, and probably even the title of strongest, at least for the time being. Moving on to the time of hidden inventory, it's actually really contentious who was the strongest prior to Gojo's awakening. A lot of people think it was Toji, others think it was really still just Gojo, but there's a couple other players who aren't always considered. Geto for one was literally Gojo's rival up until his awakening, but I don't think it's any of those 3. Gojo with the 6 Eyes and Blue alone was strong, but he wasn't strong enough to be acknowledged as a special grade, whereas Yuki Tsukumo was, so that would mean I'd be saying Yuki was the strongest in that era, but that would be a bit inconsistent because all eras technically have a constant, and that would be Kenjaku. Speaking of Kenjaku, not only would he have been around, but at some point as well, Kaori Itadori as well. Kaori Itadori being the one who Kenjaku obtained his anti-gravity curse technique from. In hidden inventory, Megumi was already a kid, meaning Yuji was already born. This in turn means that Kaori would be dead at this point and Kenjaku would be in possession of her body, meaning Kenjaku would be equipped with his anti-gravity curse technique. And that was really all it took him to stop Yuki, so he's probably the strongest. But there's factors like domain expansion, and we know that Yuki couldn't use her domain because of Tengen. But we can't actually factor in Yuki's domain because we don't know the conditions Shaw hit and a lot of other factors ascertaining to it. So the best option would be to run with Kenjaku. And this seems like a good time as ever to say it, but Kenjaku was probably the strongest of every other era that we don't know any sorcerer from. For example, the era where he was in Noritoshi Kamo, it's only right to think that Kenjaku was the strongest. And this actually transitions well into the next era, the time of Kashimo, the Edo era. Kashimo held the title of the strongest. He was so strong that he didn't even give Ryu Ishigori a second thought, Ryu being someone who took Yuta going all out to take down. So Kashimo was definitely no joke. But as we have established with that one constant, Kenjaku would always be a factor. And the fight between Kenjaku and Kashimo isn't one you would think would go in Kashimo's favor. But the thing is, it might actually go in his favor. You see, from what we know at the time, all we can assume is that this version of Kenjaku possibly has access to blood manipulation. But even that is unlikely, knowing that the Edo era was 400 years from present time, and Noritoshi Kamo would only be born around 250 years from the Edo era, meaning the only techniques we know this version of Kenjaku would possess would be his body hopping, but he'd obviously still have a domain expansion. With Kenjaku, there's always too much speculation, but this time it's even worse because we have no idea what his curse technique is, and by extension, we can't ascertain a sure hit for his domain. And then there's the whole thing with Kenjaku not wanting to face Kashimo, saying that he was weak at least in that particular body he occupied, though Kashimo didn't seem to think so. With everything we've said, the logical pick for this era would undeniably be Kashimo. Before we really delve deep into the present times, I just want to get a couple of the other calling game players out of the way. Regista and his entire bunch all seem to be reincarnated players and not awakened, but we don't exactly know what time period he existed in. Besides, Kenjaku was probably stronger than him anyways, so having covered hidden inventory, it only makes sense for us to go forward in time, see where the anime left off. And that is a very easy one, because in all of the Jujutsu Kaisen animated media, Satoru Gojo remains on top, and he will for a while. But after his demise, the strongest of the current generation falls back to Sukuna. But with Gojo's death, his students are pushing forward, 4 specifically possibly having the potential to hold the title their sensei once held, the title of strongest. With Yuji's awakening, Yuta's reveal of his domain expansion, Maki's resilience and heavenly restriction, and Hakari's luck and RCT, it's undeniable that after this whole ordeal with Sukuna is over, whoever remains standing of those 4 would very well attain that title, the title of strongest. Before ending, I also wanted to consider Uraume for the title, not necessarily for the Heian era, because for some reason Uraume found a way to traverse through time, much like Sukuna and Kenjaku do, but we don't exactly know her method. Uraume is not a reincarnated calling game player, so we don't exactly know what other time periods she was active in, and I know fans have their theories, but that's just it, their theories. Then there was also the time period where the Gojuk and Zenin clan heads murdered each other. I guess that would make those 2 the strongest at the time. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to leave a like. If you have something to say, then you can put it in the comments, and if you want to keep up to date with the channel, then please feel free to subscribe.